Hi, everyone. My name is Jonathan Hastings, and I'm really excited to be speaking at Amplify this year, and specifically talking about a culture shift we experienced at Squarespace, going from a company that worked one way to working a different way. And that's the title of my talk, The Big Shift: How We Learn to Embrace Hypothesis Driven Product Development and Change the Way We Work. So I want to start with a quote from one of my favorite television shows. I don't really know anything about sports, but I do know about The West Wing. And there's a quote from the main character, President Jeb Bartlett, who says, if you ask a professional athlete what the hardest thing to do is in sports, they'll all say hit a baseball. But a coach once told me that the hardest thing to do in sports is to walk into your Super Bowl locker room at halftime and change the strategy that got you there because it's no longer working. And that's what we're going to be talking about today: what it takes to change the company culture when what you were doing in the past made you really successful. But to get to the next stage, it's going to take something different. For folks who aren't familiar with Squarespace or who haven't listened to a podcast in the past 5 years, we're a platform for users to manage their online presence. We believe that by bringing together world class engineering and some of the best designers in the world, we're able to create a platform where anyone can stand out online. We're in the business of empowering the next generation of makers, thinkers, and doers with the tools they need to create an impactful online presence. And we do that with a modern platform that enables millions to build a brand, share their stories, and transact with customers in an impactful and beautiful online presence. I'm a group product manager for growth at Squarespace, which means my teams are responsible for acquiring, activating, and retaining users across our full suite of products. But I started my career in product at what was then a small startup called Jet.com. Back when we launched in 2015, Jet was a fairly small company that had big ambitions. We were trying to take on the dominant e-commerce players and really reinvent the way we thought about e-commerce. It took a lot of experimentation to figure out what was going to work competing in such a saturated space. And so we were really experimental, especially in the early days, in how to make the business model work. When I started, we had a membership model where users would pay a yearly fee and we essentially sold things at cost. That turned out not to work super well. But what did work super well was our ability to pass on savings in the supply chain to users as we helped them create more efficient baskets of goods. That became the kind of dominant model and how we got product market fit. About a year later, we were acquired by Walmart. I stayed for another year and then went to another company that was undergoing a bit of a shift called Rent the Runway. For folks who aren't familiar, Rent the Runway is a service that allows women to rent clothing for special occasions like weddings or parties when they're really going to wear something one time, and it might appear on Instagram or Facebook, and they didn't want to make an investment in an expensive, beautiful designer garment for something they'd only wear once. They're able to rent it. I worked on the mobile team there, and there was a massive shift happening at the company that just so happened to intersect with the work we were doing on mobile. That is, we created this new subscription model called Unlimited. And what we hadn't expected was that the previous paradigm of user interaction, where someone came to us a couple of times a year and the apps weren't really a critical part of that, would change dramatically when, in the subscription model, users were renting every single day for work. They were renting business casual. And the app was really the place where they did that, not only in terms of their retention and where they came back all the time, but really how we acquired and activated users as well. The big difference there was that those users looked a lot different from the ones that they built a business on before. And so we had to be really experimental and thoughtful and build things that told us about this new user type and what their needs were. And then I got to Squarespace. Squarespace, ironically, was the oldest company that I'd worked for and had built a phenomenally successful business by creating the world's best platform for building websites. But by the time I got there, about a year and a half ago, the way most users interacted with our platform was on something called V7. V7 was a huge step forward in what online website editors could do, and really was a powerful platform for building your website. But the catch was it had launched back in 2014, and there wasn't a lot of changes, or there weren't a lot of changes in the platform since then. And growth had started to slow down. and a lot of new incumbents were coming in the same space. We needed to figure out how to crack the nut on really accelerating user growth. And that's what my team was tasked with doing. When I came in, one of our core values was good work takes time. And from a product perspective, that's a kind of scary thing to hear, because I feel like my teams and I are judged on how much value we're delivering to customers and the velocity with which we're doing it. I'm really proud to say that now we've replaced that value with something that I think better encapsulates the way we want to work, which is to learn fast and act fast. So I want to talk about how we got there, how we went from good work takes time to something that reflects modern product development principles like learn fast and act fast. So this is a story in 3 parts. The first part is on how we got here and what some of the causal factors were in creating the culture of the past. The second part is what tools we got in place to start to create that culture shift. And then the third part is how we were able to normalize this way of working, how we changed the rituals and artifacts associated with our product development process so this became the norm. So I want to start with recognizing how we got here. And I want to start with something that sounds even more orthogonal and talk about apples, specifically red delicious apples. There's actually an interesting story here. There was a horticultural company in Louisiana that acquired the rights to an apple called the Hawkeye at the end of the 19th century. And they started spending enormous amounts of money on marketing it, and they renamed it the Red Delicious apple. And it caught on like wildfire. Over the course of the early 20th century, farmers started buying more and more of these apples, and they liked them because they turned red earlier, so you could pick them sooner and store them longer. And they found that because of their deep red color, they really stood out on produce shelves in the grocery store. And they started breeding them more and more to have these thick skins that were resistant to bruises. It just so happens that the same genes that gave it that thick skin caused it to have a kind of bitter texture around the outside and cause it to be kind of mealy in the middle. If you're like me growing up, my goal at lunchtime was always to trade this Red Delicious apple that somehow worked its way into my lunchbox for something better. And oftentimes that wasn't so successful. They've become the dominant apple around the 1970s. And in doing, they became a vehicle that went from supermarket shelves to the trash can, skipping most people's mouths completely. The reason that happened, the reason these took over the market but then have quickly lost market share, is because they were optimized for the wrong thing. That is, what was easiest for transportation and best for displaying in grocery stores, not what was best for taste. And at Squarespace, when I joined, we were working on lots of different projects related to onboarding. And many of those projects weren't as successful as what we had hoped. When we took a step back, we realized we were optimizing for the wrong things. That is, we had built an incredible business that had really phenomenal growth rates, but that had slowed down. And we were building that business around people who looked like us. This is a shot of our office lobby. It's one of the most beautiful offices I've ever been in. And we had built this product for the people who looked like the people who were in our office in the West Village. But our customers were looking more and more different from the designers and engineers we had in our own office. They reflected lots of different diverse use cases. We were doing Super Bowl ads that were attracting a totally different kind of user from the people that we'd had in the past. And so we needed a view of our customers that looked more like this, that reflected the diversity of use cases and of starting points to make them successful. So it was taking a step back and understanding what our incentives were, what were motivating our behavior, and whether those incentives were out of line with the state of our customers. That's what made us realize there probably needs to be a different way of working here. Now, everyone was aligned towards that realization. We knew that to change the speed with which we were growing, to change the slope of the line, we needed a different approach. But that took getting the right tools in place. Building great products is a team sport. It's not all up to product management. It's not all up to engineering. It's not all up to design, data science, marketing. It's everyone coming together and making things work. One of the things that makes it really tough to come together, though, is when there's a lack of shared frameworks. That is, you've got everyone who's really well-intentioned. You've got some of the smartest people in New York City all in the same room, but they're not speaking the same language. And in order to change that for us, we found three things to be really effective. The first is in how we thought about user personas. So, a lot of places have their kind of like target ideal customer. A lot of times that's couched in marketing language about how ambitious the customer is, et cetera, et cetera. Those are certainly useful. But what we found is that we needed a deeper quantitative understanding of our customer as well. So we built some really quick features. Among one of the first things that my teams built were these features to help us classify customers and understand what the state of our funnel was and what they looked like. So we started by asking three really simple questions. What's your site about? What is it you're trying to do on Squarespace? And where are you in what we called our ideation narrative? So did you just come up with this idea, or do you have an existing business that you're bringing to Squarespace? Using that data, we were able to create a profile of users using tools like Amplitude that created a common language for all teams to talk about our users. Not only my teams on the growth side, but other product teams working on the core editor, working on our commerce business, had the same attributes to describe our users. Product marketing was able to see who was working, for whom our product was working well, who we were able to acquire, who was missing in the funnel, who we didn't have, essentially, like who wasn't so successful with our platform. And it really redefined how we talked about our customers. What was key here in creating this shift is that every part of the cross-functional team that is responsible for creating great products now had this common way of talking about our users. The second thing that we found that was really successful is creating North Star metrics that we could align around. So we sort of all knew that there were certain business KPIs that we cared about, things that made the bottom line successful. For me and my teams, that manifested as the rate with which users subscribe. But it's really hard to task product teams, product marketing teams, data science teams with moving something like a business KPI. So we started to decompose those into their underlying signals, the things in the product that show up that are kind of leading indicators of a user's likelihood of subscribing. We started using tools like Amplitude, like our expert data scientists, like user research to understand what was influencing it. But then we had to go one step further. We had to repeat this process for other parts of the business, like retention. And then we had to decompose those signals into things that could go into something like a dashboard. So those signals were sort of micro indicators of a user's performance or their likelihood of subscribing, but we needed a macro signal, something that described the aggregate users. And so instead of looking at time to trial, we started looking at things like average time to trial. Instead of looking at one user survival rate, we started looking at the percentage of users split up by a certain customer segment or by information that we gathered earlier up in the funnel around the percentage of users who are active after, let's say, 10 minutes in the platform. And by understanding those metrics and tasking teams with certain parts of it, we're able to get alignment around team goals and give some clarity there. It's also important to say that these were evergreen metrics. They were things that we were looking at consistently. We also decomposed these into time-bound units, things that we said that we could affect in the span of 6 weeks or a quarter. And those are different from the North Star metrics that we're kind of always looking at. Getting clarity on that was really essential in aligning teams around a common mission. And the last part that really helped us was by changing our approach to design. As I said, we have some of the best designers in New York City at Squarespace. But sometimes that meant we would just build something we thought was really beautiful and release it out into the world and hope for the best. Instead, we started taking a more probabilistic view of what the future could look like. Sometimes our interventions work, sometimes they don't. And so we start with this artifact when we're about to launch an experiment. We call it the premortem. The idea here is that we define collectively with the engineering team, with the design team, with product, with data science, with all of the folks who are responsible for a given experiment, all the things that we think could happen. What are the possible results of this? And not only how could the metrics move, but what would cause those metrics to move? Is it because users didn't like the experience? Is it because we put the wrong content in, et cetera, et cetera? And then we ask ourselves, how would we know which of those causal indicators is what really happened? And then we say, what would we do next? The reason that's so important to do before we started building the product, before we have high fidelity mocks, before we even have a design spec, is in order to influence what design goes into the product. Maybe we need a button to tell us whether users are engaging with this thing or not. Maybe we need to make sure that we've instrumented the scroll depth so we can see how users are engaging with something to know what's driving their behavior. All of these things influence the design stage, and very often design happens before these questions have been asked. Likewise, we found it's really helped engineering teams understand what to build durably and what to build for the long run, what to put a lot of effort into, and what things that we should be scrappier and more iterative with, because there are lots of future branches of this decision tree that don't require so much fortified backend service or something like that. And so this has helped reframe everyone's thinking of our product development process from being a little bit of this fictive lie of like, we know what we're going to build in 3 months and 6 months and 12 months, to instead being a more accurate view of the world that says, here are the things that we will build if this other thing happens. And we're able to give transparency to our stakeholders that way. And then the last part here is in how we've normalized this way of thinking and this way of working. Again, I don't know much about sports, but I do know you don't want to give up yardage in football. And that's exactly how we thought about this. I want to take you back a couple of years to an internet meme. If you haven't heard it, you should Google this. There's an audio clip where there's a noise made. Some people heard the word Laurel. Some people heard the word Yanni. You might remember fights broke out on the internet about this. And what I remember about that experience was that I heard one of those things until I didn't, until I heard the other one. And when I was hearing Laurel, I couldn't imagine hearing Yanni. I thought people were crazy for hearing something else. But then I heard the other thing. And I think this way of working is really similar. There are a lot of people who could get behind this kind of way of working, who understand the vocabulary. But until you've actually done it, until you've actually tried to work iteratively and from a customer-obsessed, hypothesis-driven way, it's pretty hard to actually imagine. And so we've been able to normalize it with a couple of artifacts. One of them is with the way we look at roadmaps. Instead of saying, here's a Gantt chart of all the things that are going to happen for the next 3, 6, 12 months, we instead say, here's our objective. We know that we are playing in this space. We think it's going to have this impact for users. We're going to try to create these outcomes for our users. And they're going to be measurable in these ways. And here are our hypotheses for how we think we can do that. And if they turn out to be right, we'll do this next. If they turn out to be wrong, we'll do this other thing next. But this is a much more accurate view of the product development process than what we had before. Another thing that we've started to do among the product team is instead of celebrating all of the things that we've launched, which by the way, we still do that, we're still excited about launching a new feature, we ritualize the idea of learning. So we have these product management learning shares where the thing that we celebrate is a new insight we have about users or the market. And that's kind of the primary motivating unit of product development at Squarespace. So we get really excited about sharing this new insight that we have about users. So a couple of takeaways on how we were able to do this. The first is it didn't happen all at once. It wasn't as though we woke up one day and suddenly we were in this very hypothesis-driven world. Instead, it was a series of events, a series of successes where we were sure to keep that yardage that we've gotten. It started with taking a step back and assessing what we knew and what we didn't, where our incentives were misaligned from the way we all knew we wanted to work, but we weren't working at that time. And then as we made progress on it, we created artifacts and rituals that reinforce that approach. When your documents, when your roadmaps, when all of those things are saying one thing, but the product teams are saying another, creates misalignment. And by changing the representations of our work, we were able to make a lot of progress in that way. And because of that, that's now the norm. That's the general way that we operate. And that's my talk. Thanks.